Okay, as I said, we're coming out of intense celebrations, organizing, and so on for the 70th anniversary of the first state visit to Austria, which was a state visit by Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia in 1954, even 6 months before before Austria was even independent and sovereign again. So we had a lot of input on that. Yeah, a lot of thinking about that. But Jahlani Niaah and I have been working together much longer than that. And Jahlani Niaah is not only the head of the Rastafari Studies Unit at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, but he's also the co-founder of the School of Sacrament Rastafari University, SOSACRU, which was founded between the Rastafari Studies Unit in Jamaica and the Universal Development of Rastafari, IDOR. So it already in its founding brings together community activism and academia. And that was the idea behind SOSACRU from the beginning. I have been then a graduate assistant, have been with SOSACRU since the first, before the first summer school. So I've witnessed all of the summer schools, one online, two in person, and one I was only organizationally involved because I could not attend. The first summer school in person was in St. Lucia, the second one in Jamaica this year, actually. And this just as a little introduction to already start our reasoning. It is the Rastafari Reasonings project. We talk about Rastafari methodologies. And I think I can already say that right away. Reasonings is one of the main, or the main, maybe even methodology of Rastafari. And so I would like already like to go into this reasoning and to ask you, Jahlani, why was it for you necessary to co-found the School of Sacrament Rastafari University, and what do you think is Rastafari contributing to methodologies, maybe doing things differently? Why was it maybe necessary to do things differently?
Okay. Give thanks. Greetings. Greetings, colleagues. I want to start by first greeting you in the conventional Rastafari way. We would greet you in the name of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie I and Empress Menen Aswa. And that greeting indicates that I'm Ethiopian. My politics is Ethiopian, and my purpose is centered on that Ethiopianism that has been a part of how we have come to refashion ourselves in a post-colonial context. Dominic has been a wonderful colleague, and it's interesting we're having this conversation here in Austria because Dominic is one of the best graduate students of the movement, by which I mean that, his knowledge of the literature, imagination, the theocracy, all the elements is really quite advanced. And he has been a tremendous resource in what he has described to you as our Rastafari University, the School of the Sacrament, which now is moving into its 5th year, at the end of this month, December. He's asked a very specific question as to why this was necessary and what it is that Rastafari might be thought of as contributing as method. And I am going to answer that. I'm presuming I'm being understood, everyone. There's no problem in communication. So, and please feel free to raise your hands or to jot down anything that might fly over your head, so to speak. Dominic, I want to I want to answer your question by not immediately going to the School of the Sacrament, but just seeking to provide some introductory remarks on what could be considered reasoning, and particularly reasoning as method. One source I would like to recommend is perhaps my very first article I wrote as a graduate student. This is something in 2004, which appeared in Cultural Studies, the journal, and it's called Poverty Lab Oratory. So it's Poverty Lab Oratory. I am therefore going to describe or entitle this paper Poverty Lab Oratory 3, because I've done 2 versions of that paper, and this is the 3rd. And this version of Poverty Lab Oratory is called Reasoning as Method. So just to give you a visual, it's Poverty Lab Oratory, you know, and the context is, you know, simply that out of poverty, brethren, Rastafari brethren, constructed a scientific, perhaps even a laboratory as to how to reconstruct the word and the world through word sound, or the aesthetic of speech, what we call speechifying, but coming back to the word, which is what Rastafari has held as very important. Word sound power is one of the mantras that Rastafari chants, and in the way that the Bible tells you, in the beginning there was the word, Rastafari holds that understanding that that word is perhaps the most important seed of creation, that the word is the seed itself, and the word gives life, brings forth life. So Kingston, in my mind, emerges as a Rastafari hotbed of imagination, research, dialogue, conversations about transformation of self, about upliftment of people, about trying to get out of poverty, finding solutions for post-colonial issues, finding ways to transform community, individuals, etc. So hold in mind this notion of artry as a kind of art of speaking, of representation, etc. And then place in front of that the notion of scarce resources, post-coloniality, issues of entitlement and opportunity and justice and survival, all of which comes back in a vivid way to the idea of poverty. So in placing that in front of you, I want to identify reasoning as very much normal, natural. It's nothing rocket science or mind-blowing. In fact, Jake Homiak, who is one of the leading Rastafari scholars, would put reasoning within the idea of sound, or the soundscape, you know, the same connection to word and sound and power. But if we look at reasoning in this sonic imagination, it really starts earlier in the form called street preaching. So the first revolutionaries, Pan-Africanists, religious leaders, not just in the Caribbean, but across the colonial world, they actually took to the streets. They created little props, you know, a podium, a few drums. There are no microphones in those days, but they would use various sonic percussive methods to bring people's attention to them and the space that they were occupying. Street preaching in Kingston was famous in the early 1910s, 20s, common sight, especially in the urban areas. Well, Leonard Howell, who is the first Rastafari preacher, comes to our attention first through street preaching. And one would argue this is the genesis of Rastafari reasoning, because what he would have done is he would have gone into a space that people were preaching, you know, the end of the world and, you know, Judgment Day and all of that. And he would have taken that platform and he would have introduced a new message about Rastafari, things they'd never heard before, a word they'd never seen before. All of these imaginations, they had not necessarily been paying attention, but had preparation based on the general rhetoric of Christianity, which says, you know, redemption is going to come, Christ is going to come back, etc. But Leonard Howell takes to street preaching to announce that Christ had returned literally in Ethiopia. You know, Messiah, black, come back. He's alive and well, walked in Egypt and they're seeing him and he's going to come to the Caribbean and he's going to meet with you. Leonard Howell introduces the concept of African redemption in the space of street preaching. But if you understand what the street offers, it doesn't offer you anything different from the regular conventional structure of I am up here and you're down here and I'm talking at you. The street preaching is not generally dialogical. You know, it's usually one-sided where people are getting information and you are the authority for that information. That's how Rastafari comes to be introduced. Persons were shown portraits of His Majesty. These portrait was sold as something that people needed to, you know, direct their minds to, begin to shape their understanding, to pay attention to His law and His way, and to orient themselves to this new liberator who Howell introduces. Street preaching, I would say, becomes, give thanks, my brother, you're just in time. Yeah. Street preaching becomes less present within Rastafari once the movement gets a little better established. And part of the problem with the street preaching approach is that the street preaching got Howell in jail. You know, the police came, took diligent notes, and these notes were brought against Howell and sedition and arrest and imprisonment. So that episode that allowed him to introduce himself to people became contained. You know, Howell written a book, The Promised Key. And in his absence, the book became that point of reference for the congregation that he had started to develop. So he's arrested, he's removed from public domain, but he has this book that is out there and people are working with it. I think this is where reasoning actually begins. I think the reasoning begins in that space where the main leader has kind of been taken off the mark. And now people have to come together and make sense of what they've learned, what they don't know, what they're reading in this book, and this new system that is unfamiliar but inspiring. And this becomes, in my mind, the main attribute that reasoning has, which is it becomes a gathering among us to try and make sense of the world at a basic level. The world that we're trying to make sense of is going to be governed by who is present. What are the main concerns, challenges? What is the knowledge that we bring to this moment, and how we harmonize those things in a direct way for whatever outcome we are seeking to achieve. So I would say reasoning begins to emerge within Rastafari very early. In the immediate period around Haile's absence and his presence itself. But it becomes a system, a way that people begin to digest what he has been offering them. And he is not singular in the conversation that is being introduced. There are other contemporaries who also bring this insight that Haile brings. So there is a gathering and a certain kind of energy to dialogue, discourse, figure out, throw out all of the various kinds of critical things that are important. I will also talk about a barnyard and also a fasting ritual. And I think those things, if you read his book, The Promised Key, those things become refined over time. But he really suggests that there needs to be a kind of ritual of preparation of self, physically and mentally, in order to develop the fullness of this new doctrine of Rastafari. And that space that he suggests as the barnyard no longer exists like that. We now know it as Rasta camp and those things, but in the early inscription, he writes it up as a kind of isolation that one finds themselves in, where they start to remove certain things. Salt as one of the things that is removed from your diet. And the fasting, when you break the fast, and some of the meditative ideas that you needed to hold when you come into that consciousness. So reasoning, therefore, progresses from a kind of pedantic, in the street message to figuring out what this message is among people who now have a text, to a process that is being suggested to renew yourself and heal, cleanse and fast, etc. And that barnyard, I think, eventually becomes the early Rastafari camps. Now, the camps are also a space where individuals gather for various reasons. But the camps were largely about cannabis. And the camps became collective security. So Rasta camp was where individuals could go and get Rastafari sacrament, but also experience Rastafari culture, Rastafari process, and Rastafari becoming that dialogical engagement, which we are describing as reasoning. The camps in this regard have still remained the main day-to-day site where this idea of reasoning can be experienced. So if we're looking at the long evolution, the street preaching, the barnyard and Rasta camp all have linked evolution to bring us to where we are now, which is the camp as the main thing. There is no street preaching and there's no barnyard, but there is the camp, and it has remained so for a while. The camp is not singular as a Rastafari space, though. It's just one of the spaces. It's perhaps the most accessible space now. There are other spaces like tabernacles. Tabernacle is like a church or a chapel. These are usually specific to a congregation, and they are not spaces that would be 24/7, 365. You know, it's not a 24-hour every day. The tabernacles and tabernacles are usually specific for events, even though in some instances, like among some congregations, you have regular tabernacle worship, specifically among the Bobo Shanti, but we won't really talk that much about that group right now. So I'm saying then that space becomes important. Reasoning is about space as well. And if we are to recall, Rastafari at one point was outcast. So, you know, any group of Rastafari was cause for concern, and police alert, and perhaps police harassment, and perhaps arrest, etc. So if you are going to kind of get a definition of reasoning, then I would say reasoning is awakening. That's a sort of accessible term. You know, it's waking up. It's a process of waking up. I like to refer to Paulo Freire's notion of conscientization. I think Freire actually wrote up Rastafari process. You know, his book comes out in the early 70s after we've well entrenched this thing in Trenchtown over decades before. But he's really referring to the South American context of religious, what is it called? The liberation theology process out of South America, and how the Catholics aligned themselves to assist various other communities to achieve what they wanted to by helping them to understand the nature of the beast of colonialism and some of their own intentionality that they need to engage in order to make change. Well, reasoning or awakening or conscientization, in my mind, is a ritual of becoming and being. And that becoming is becoming awoken, and that being is becoming confidently your Rastafari self and voice. It therefore is a process of induction, in a sense. Reasoning occurs within oneself. So it's a self-centered process, as well as it is a collective process where you can reason among a group. But often, you know, you hear within Rastafari, I man a reason with I self, where it often has its genesis, that the debate and the resolutions are linked into the heavens, so to speak. I would also say that reasoning becomes a kind of test for ideas, a sounding board for your own philosophy. your own philosophy and your own development. To put it another way, reasoning becomes a kind of triangulation. You know, you will hear people in a Rastaman or even an artist will say, homicide, homicide, homicide. He's really speaking, but he's also asking for confirmation if this sounds sensible. It sounds like something that can get out there. Does it sound valid? You know, do you approve this sound? You know, and what does that represent as far as we are concerned as a collective sound? You know, that we are in one voice providing the sound that is righteous, so to speak. Reasoning is also a kind of juridical process in the sense that it helps to establish the code of conduct, but it also helps to deal with issues that are problematic, that might need arbitration and ventilation, you know, correction, so to speak, but need to be advised to the whole community and for that to be centered in the congregation's mind. How is it that the congregation feels about that thought, action, or what has been presented to the gathering? So it establishes the codes of conduct where they exist, moral direction. It helps to streamline the philosophical argumentation and premises as well. But I also would like to identify reasoning as a kind of projectile, a visionary intentionality, you know. So we reason not just about that which has passed, but we reason in creating that future we want to create in a specific way. I want to also say how reasoning is different from other Rastafari, or why is reasoning important in the way that we're saying? Why is it a distinct ritual of Rastafari? Now, we talk about various kinds of rituals within Rastafari. Nabbing is one, which is a festive ritual that kind of brings a lot together in one space, you know. So it brings the sacrament, it brings the voices, it brings the family, it brings the various elements of Rastafari signifiers, you know, fire and drums, and you know, it's a fulsome production. But reasoning doesn't necessarily come with all of that, but it can. So reasoning is the most common, to go back to what Dominic said, practice within Rastafari. You know, we say normally reasoning can't done, cannot finish. It has no beginning and no end. You know, reasoning is out there and available. It's therefore a practice that doesn't require any gatekeepers in that way. You know, you don't have to be permitted to reason. You don't need a particular space, etc. It therefore has somewhat fluid boundaries, you know, and those fluid boundaries are determined by who is in reasoning. It can be appointed, as in scheduled, or it can be unappointed, incidental, but there are no coincidence within Rastafari because everything is within divine order, you know. So we kind of maximize on the the zeitgeist of things just happening and kind of seizing those opportunities to make good them. There's no specific leadership required either. However, there are protocols in reasoning, even though it seems so loose and free form. Reasoning is inclusive. You know, no one is kind of sidelined and marginalized and say you can't open your mouth. Even though that might be somewhat questionable, especially in the early Rastafari Genesis, where gender separation issues might have excluded women's voices, which are still somewhat muted in the Rastafari space, but not absent, you know, increasingly present. Reasoning also is respectful, very importantly. You know, you could be reasoning and once the tones sound disrespectful, someone is reminding you, you know, that, hey, keep it civilized. Rastafari have a certain standard, you know, don't go to the bomber carts and all of the various other, you know, vulgar expressions. We are expecting a certain level of decorum here. Not saying that it can't get explosive, you know, reasoning can get explosive as well. But generally, there is a reminder about civility and conduct. Reasoning is also dynamic as far as the subject is concerned, you know. It's current affairs, it's theocracy, it's personal issues, it's the congregation and family. It becomes a kind of dynamic and a vibrant offering of community interests. That's what it tends to present. In my mind, reasoning is not reasoning if you're not smoking. So this is a very alien process here. You know, it's like we are all just looking at one another and we're not sharing a sacrament, which is what is going to inspire a certain heights of reasoning. So yeah, there's reasoning and then there's real reasoning when we seated with the sacrament, which is another aspect of the ritual. And we can maximize the mental and communal benefits that we are feeling and deriving from sharing that sacrament. So one could even say real reasoning begins when you light the cup or the spliff or the chalice or the herb. But it's not to say you can't reason without those. You know, it just sounds like me talking to you in this room, which is kind of a two-dimensional as opposed to a three-dimensional reasoning. So reasoning gets on to a higher level and a higher order. I'm not going to continue that much longer, Dominic. I kind of just wanted to put some things down. How was this operationalized then as a kind of action? You know, because Rastafari often is said to, you know, get into too much of the talk and we're not seeing action. And I think it's not a fair assessment. Action is often very subtle and not as tangibly evident as you might see. So I would say that the idea of Black Lives Matter has been the central focus of Rastafari. You didn't call it that. You know, the hashtag that has emerged in the last few years has kind of reminded me that that has been our central conversation, not just Black lives, you know, but human life and human dignity matters. That's what we have been guided and understood from His Majesty. Reasoning has also, in my mind, provided a meta-narrative that surrounds us as a community. So without opening my mouth, people have some understanding of what Rastafari represent. And I think that that is the way that reasoning has been insidious and has have been absorbed beyond the space of reasoning into the wider context. So ideas of Babylon, reasoning gives us a certain text about that, but most people here know that Rasta talk about Babylon. Would I be correct in saying that people have heard that reference that Rasta have this notion of Babylon that them okay? And some people might even know that we are saying that Babylon is a vampire and bloodsucker and all of these things, and some of that becomes available because of the way reasoning has been expanded. But I think there is a kind of ability to break silence that reasoning has, the silencing of African voices has been a major issue that we have seen consistently. I want to say a couple more things and then come to what Dominic had asked me to speak about. Reasoning has also evolved. So back to Homian, everything used to be kind of analog, which is the face-to-face and the drum and coming together for reasoning. And then reasoning evolved with technology. This is Homian now. And he's saying, well, you move from that analog drum 1, 2, and you're now into media. You have 45s, you have albums, you have tape decks, you have CDs. Reasonings are now transported. We're having a reasoning here, it's on the web. There's 6 persons who are not here, but they're in this reasoning. You're fashioning a reasoning, but it's now a reggae song, which can be a chart hit, it can be played on the radio. This is still Rastafari reasoning because the song itself came out of reasoning. In Trench Town, in the government yard, etc. So, in my mind, the whole idea of multimedia really begins with the distribution of reggae recordings, vinyls. The interesting thing is that when Rastafari production started in the inner cities of Kingston, the output was getting to Europe within a day or two. You press a record in Kingston, the first flight out of Kingston is on and available in Brixton, and then from Brixton it gets to Vienna, etc., etc. So the genius of incorporating the art of music as the publication of the reasoning. The reggae song becomes the quintessential sort of aesthetically approved aspects of reasoning. Producer sit down and work, engineer sit down and work, man and man work on the lines and the lyrics. Somebody give you a word there and somebody say take out that word there, and by the time you're finished, you have a redemption song, or you have No Woman No Cry, or you have equal rights and justice, or whatever it is that becomes a chart hit. The ability now to move from Rastafari process into Rastafari publication became, in my mind, one of the genius of transferring from analog to digital and getting concrete the ideas that Dominic is a product of that teleporting of reasoning. It didn't have to come to Kingston to hear Rasta message and voice, but what he had to come to Kingston for is to get the gritty that we couldn't transport, the smell and the taste, but everything else, documented and transported and shared in that way. But then, so Homea calls that the media scape. And he has a wonderful article that Dominic will share. That's called From Soundscape to Mediascape, which introduces this whole conversation as to how Rastafari has, revolutionized the way to get ideas circulated out. But in my mind now, the biggest genius of reasoning is actually orchestrated in 2003 when the Rastafari community organizes a global reasoning. And I'm not calling it that. That's what it was called, the global reasoning with Rastafari from around the world taking place. This is street preaching now at the global level, if you understand. So if you're looking at 100 years now, you move from the very face-to-face to the imagination of calling a globe together. 100 years before, you were not even a known voice. 100 years later, you have a global community. And the members in Jamaica who were responsible for putting this together were clear about the use of community and family in describing the globe. So we're not saying, different groups. We're saying, no, it's a global Rastafari family reasoning. And by that, we're saying that we're on the same page with certain ideals and objectives that we might want to pursue. All right, so to come now, having said all of that, to the questions that were posed at the start from my brother, Dominic. So as much as reasoning is and has been a solid method for us internally, for the development of I-self, for the development of I and I as a collective, and for also situating our community in a more global context. All of that, in my mind, is not enough to take us safely forward into the future. What is the role of the scholar, in the community? How does the scholar impact a community such as Rastafari, which is in itself its own kind of scholarship? I like to frame Rastafari as a faculty of interpretation. It's not my idea. It's again, Mortimer Plano. But he speaks of Rastafari in faculty terms. It's a new faculty of overstanding, and that positions us to now say, but what does that mean? Okay, so it sounds revolutionary because we're saying that we don't have this. And this is something that comes to us fresh and new. And Plano goes on to say that the Rastafari need to contribute to knowledge production because knowledge production is bankrupt right now. It's run out of ideas. It don't know where it's going. It's imploding on itself. And in a real way, it requires the creativity, the insights, the imagination that Rastafari holds. In my mind, I think the movement is now so global that it needs more clear institutional support. And I don't mean it needs to be institutionalized. We're not saying that. But it needs to have systems that people can access and grow, according to their level. They say when the student is ready, the teacher appears. But when the student is ready, the teacher disappears. But the space that the student can become, themselves a leader, to be able to make their own unique contribution. People think it's about repetition and doing what has been done before, but we don't necessarily see it that way. We see it as striving for new heights of progress and liberation, and to be able to reflect and demonstrate that. So to come to the task that Dominic has asked me to say a little about. For the last 30 years, I've been at the University of the West Indies, or maybe a little longer than 30 years. And in the last 15 years, we've had Rastafari Elder Mortimer Planner, who was a part of the faculty. And what that did was that helped in making our wider community more comfortable with the university. I read a speech from His Majesty that he's really saying that university is our hope in the future. And this is still something that is resisted a lot. People think, when it's CIA and come to suck out with knowledge and get wealthy, and you're gonna get PhD off of people who, you fly gone and left. And a lot of that has happened and it's true. But at the heart of it still, the space that the university provides is still one of the most conscientiously humane space for the pursuit of equality and justice and liberation and all of that. It's based on our ability to sit down together and figure out things that the world advances, right? And His Majesty is very clear about that. So in thinking about ourselves as scholars in a community that is peripheral to central scholarship, we ask ourselves the question, what do we need to secure in order for this movement, its philosophy, its overall contribution in terms of theocracy, theology, moral guide, entertainment, and cultural value? How can we help to frame that in a way that is sustainable and also increasingly international in the way that a university works? And in a sense, Rastafari has been critical of itself for a while. We don't have hospital. We shouldn't need any, because our liberty is supposed to keep us sustained and healthy. But there are still things that you might need to go to a doctor for. We don't have our own medical facilities in the way that we want. And we certainly don't have our own school institutions in the way that we want. There have been some attempts at Rastafari schools in Jamaica, in St. Lucia, Trinidad, and elsewhere. But none have really thrived in the way that you would hope. We should have the kind of educational institution that people are putting their names on lists for 10 years to wait to enter. And our spaces should be so limited because, people are so desperate to get in. That's what we represent where knowledge is concerned. We don't have an institution that commands that kind of appeal. But if you look at other religious communities, taking care of your own intellectual development is a big part of it, but not just your own. Being able to offer that beyond your own is also a big part of it. Jewish schools have everyone there, Chinese schools, everyone is there, etc. So SOSACRU, therefore, which is the organization that Dominic and I have been associated with, he's also one of the founding members. SOSACRU is seeking to make an inroad in the tertiary space that we hold. And that came out of an understanding that we have global colleagues. Many of them have done PhDs on Rastafari and on that subject. Dominic is perhaps, 30th or 40th in a line of international PhDs on Rastafari. Some of them are Jamaican, some of them are not Jamaicans. We have people in China, Japan, Grand Canyon, South America, you name it, with interest in researching Rastafari. And some of them have established careers, and some of them we've worked with for 20 years, doing things together, conferences, writing joint articles, etc. But we failed to galvanize a collective for permanent action, projects, and vision. And interestingly, I think lockdown kind of allowed space for grand ideas that were necessary. And so SOSACRU actually used that lockdown space to take the idea of reasoning to a more institutional character. We wanted to be able to identify resources within the community who were not necessarily highlighted but are important workers. We wanted to be able to document the history of Rastafari. I have students who find the worst online garbage to reference. The more cheesy it is the more they found it. And generally it's the bubblegum aspect of the scholarship. It's not based on any field work, it's not based on any real knowledge, it's not even reference, it's just things out there, and that's what they're finding. And increasingly they're now referring to Dominic's work, so we feel good. So they're not finding only the bubblegum things, but the other things that are available. But we really wanted to, especially in the tertiary and the academic space, but in the wider community space, to be able to provide trustworthy content that was well researched and presented on things that were being overlooked but seriously important to our community. So for example, we started out our space by attending to the gender issues that have always been critical and criticized within Rastafari, centering what has been described as the matriarchal shift, where women and women's voices and women's pragmatic organizational contribution have actually been driving the movement in the last 20 and 30 years in a way that is not written on. But the students are still writing that Rastafari is a patriarchal movement where women are the most oppressed, because there is nothing being written on what is really being advanced by women and for women. And it's far more sexy to talk about how oppressive the movement is than that there is some kind of internal conversation happening about gender balancing and gender equity. In fact, I would argue that Rastafari within the Jamaican landscape has gone further than any other community in attending to issues of gender and gender balance. So we first wanted to create a space that colleagues could work together in online. And we also felt that in bringing together colleagues to work in that space online, that we could also direct students in the way that an institution for higher learning does. The development of a university is hard work, and it's a long process. And those things get advanced based on your faculty and your output. So we feel fairly confident that, you know, over time, we're going to continue developing the faculty and the documentation, production, publication, output that will give us the increased relevance in the wider community that we hope to have. In terms of returning more generally to reasoning and to just, I'm going to stop so that we can, you know, talk. In thinking about the reasoning and the SOSACRU space, pedagogy that is egalitarian, you know, that strives to be inclusive and, you know, without gender issues and race and all of that, I think is still a new frontier for us. You know, very subtle conventions that disenfranchise people still exist. But notwithstanding that, we've introduced Rastafari studies at the university level because at this moment, we think that students need this Caribbeanist theoretical foundation. It's interesting that, you know, you can pass through the University of the West Indies and don't understand the Caribbean. You know, and by that, I mean in a political or sociological sense. And we think that the Rastafari movement, in a nutshell, has garnered a very effective representation of Caribbean history and sociology in a way that is very germane for students coming out of a tertiary institution. So what we end up doing is, you know, guided by myself and others who covered the literature and the pragmatic aspects, we've had a number of courses within the mainstream University of the West Indies that students can do. But those courses become trivial to their own field immersion within Rastafari spaces. So we prepare them in the classroom to take them into a Rastafari field trip. And usually their minds are blown so much that when they come back, you know, they have a different sense of themselves and the community. You know, they go out in the field to Rastafari, and Rastafari are treating them as though they are the next set of world leaders. You know, you all at university, how are you going to fix Iraq? Or, you know, Ukraine? Is that kind of approach people are coming to them with? And the man is talking to me as if I'm important, you know. So students actually come to realize that the same thing His Majesty tells us about the importance of education and tertiary education in particular, that Rastafari are trying to retrofit self without those resources, coming back to the poverty laboratory. Yeah. Academics pale in comparison to the Rastafari academic. Deep researcher, you know, you're surprised what him turn up. He's all looking onto the moon and the stars, literally, in order to complete the research that he's doing. And he's doing this every day. We academics, we pick up the work and we say, oh boy, the work is so heavy. Rastafari pick up the work and the work is light because the work is very enthusiastic for them. So in a way, the movement, I think, is a faculty of teachers, a faculty of teachers of Africa and African liberation in particular. But the faculty has, broadened beyond the Jamaican context. It's now a global community, a global faculty. I mean, I don't know if people know King Shiloh. I find him amazing from Jamaica. He is a Dutch white reggae DJ who has one of the biggest global followings, including bigging up people in Trenchtown, Kingston, but interesting because he's now taking reasoning to international conversation that is real time, and linking the reasoning up at that level. And there've been a few like him, persons like Muta Baruka, is that mediascape reasoning that's online or on radio regularly available. And in fact, it's one of the main modalities of Rastafari now, that radio space. Years ago, when I used to go to the United States and reggae was not as big as it was the college radio stations that used to pirate the reggae music. And the same thing in the UK. The early attention to Jamaican culture was pirate. But now, increasingly, you have Rastafari individuals who are DJs, or you have Rastafari artists who work as DJs on radio stations. And usually the framework is reasoning with the selections of reggae music as an additional complement to that. So just to seal up, in terms of what can we learn as students, as faculty from Rastafari's process, I think, how we use ourselves, our bodies, our personhood in the research process is very critical. We tend to think of research as kind of abstract thing, as though we are like AI, just programmed, and we're not idiosyncratic individuals. It's our idiosyncrasies that are going to give us good research. And I think that the Rastafari understanding of self really allows for you to be yourself in the field with research. So there's always something new to unearth, because you are not necessarily expecting yourself to be striving for something orthodox, but instead you're trying to bring new interpretation to the things that might be orthodox based on your own experience. Dominic, I know I haven't answered your question, but...
You have answered my question in a very beautiful way. Thank you very much. I actually wanted still to go a bit now, as third world would say, now that we have found love, what are we gonna do with it? So what are we gonna do with it? A bit more into that, but since we are nearly at an end already, to give students also the possibility to ask questions and come into reasoning. I will just say quickly on the aspect of reasoning and action that Rastafari is very critical of talk shop, as we know. And as an example, this 70th anniversary was basically an example of that. It started with reasonings years before, and different brethren and sisters would bring in reasonings generated from Rastafari community itself, Rasta from Nigeria, Ghana, together with Rasta from St. Lucia, from Austria, reasoning about this and what is the importance and what should come together. And so it came out and it had an impact also for the communities beyond the academic divide. Or for example, the Ethiopian communities in Vienna, we know it had a very important impact, Rastafari community, African communities. And so I wanted to go a bit into the research activism aspect, but since we have not so much time anymore, I just want to mention this, drop this here. Maybe some of the questions will go into this direction anyway. If there are any questions, please feel free.
Brother John, just like to make a clarification. So the Baum camp is in reflection to the holistic side of the movements and say balms and potions. No, am I correct? Not balm as balm,
Right.
you wrote balm.
Explain what a balm is.
Yeah. So if I get you correctly, you're saying I'm not necessarily giving clarity about this barnyard.
Barnyard.
Yeah, the language of the barnyard no longer obtains within Rastafari, but in Howell's book, he starts out by referring to the barnyard. And Brother John is reminding us that naturopathy and, you know, the whole holistic approach is something that is really strong in Rastafari. People claim that it comes from much further back, you know, Kumina, revivalism, Mayalism, but that whole system of herbs and bush medicine and how those are used. And in fact, thanks for that, Uncle Johnny, because that livity is a big part of what Rastafari work on collectively. You know, how to avoid hospital and doctor, who we know is just going to kill you and poison you off, you know. Martin Maplano looked at the medicine he and said, this is what they call drugs and poison, you know. You know, that's why you need doctor to give you this, because if you don't get prescription, this is going to kill you. Drugs and poison. And Rasta don't like those things. So the Howell was clear about mental preparation and physical preparation through that barnyard context. It has become increasingly what we describe as livity, without necessarily as a go-to space, but maintained in the reasoning, you know. And one of the things I like, you know, if you're smoking a chalice and you're coughing too much, someone is going to tell you what herb you need. You've not been drinking your, you know, your alkaline teas, or someone is going to start saying, you know, or here is a little roots, so and so, drink a little of this, and it's going to, you know, so there's been a kind of eclectic approach to solving issues that turn up, and sharing ideas related to wellness. And certainly the naturopathic healing aspects of the community is one of the things that you actually study. You know, you might have a particular elder who works with certain kinds of processes that you draw onto in order to acquire certain knowledge or understanding. I'm not sure if that's what you were saying, Uncle Johnny.
True.
Okay.
At the same time, to use already uttered words, Rastafari being a way of life, a pathway to the Almighty through the holistic practices.
Yeah, man.
I think also holds context, no?
Yeah. Give thanks for that. Yeah.
Any further, maybe also like Brother John had some clarifications. I think this time we were not in the heretical, but we were into certain words and terminologies still that might.
Also with the promise key, obviously that was, let's say, a furtherment of the Egyptian Book of the Dead
Mm.
to say as a place
Well,
of
well,
reference?
Well, actually, the direct reference, Royal Parchment Scroll,
Oh, thank you.
Royal
Thank you,
Parchment
thank
Scroll
you,
of Black Supremacy.
thank you.
Yeah. But you're saying in the same kind of significance as that kind of text.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. And also the Holy Pibi is somewhat reflected through that.
Any questions? Maybe how now to use some of this? What is the importance? For example, I this year or last year was speaking here also using SOSACRU as an example in a context of decolonizing. Decolonizing academia is of course important. Any kind of how can that all of that what we heard now help us in our own research, in our approach, For example, I heard a lot about ownership. I was speaking also in the context of SOSACRU about ownership, who defines what is knowledge and about Rastafari, but that is of course an example that can go in many contexts. There's not only Rastafari, where outsiders write about Rastafari and define knowledge about certain communities. Maybe in any of these kind of contexts, or how it can help you with your own work. Maybe you have any questions.
I had a question about, not quite that, but about the idea of inclusivity that Rastafari offers, especially when we think of Rastafari becoming more and more global, but it also being centered on the idea of Black Lives Matter and being centered as a post-colonial method of methodology. And I was just wondering if it becomes global and also in this through media, but if a part of reasoning is also this mental and physical preparation that you need, I was just wondering about the corruption of ideas, or I mean, who do we if also if space is so important, like who do we let into this space of our reasoning that is also that belongs to a specific community, and where do we draw the lines to protect this knowledge and to protect this practice from becoming corrupted, because I see the danger of that.
I love your question. In fact, I kind of listened to figure out what you were trying to frame, and then and your question really, it speaks to concerns that are existing within Rastafari about security, but at the same time, the community is very driven much by faith. So you're not going to find, guards with guns. And generally, even historically, outsiders, so-called outsiders, have been welcome somewhat. Once them can go through the fire. So I take you to a bingy, you're not going to be physically attacked, but you might get a hell of verbal attack. And at the end of the day, most people get it that it really is a test of you. Are you firm in yourself? Do you know why you're here? are you a spy? You know, and so there is a very confrontational way of dealing with the outside and to allow things to play out, you know, themselves. We know that resistance to what we're doing exists, but you can't really fear men and people, you know. So what I've learned from those elders is you set your boundaries. There are people who are going to be curious and want to see what's happening, and there are some people who are going to be genuine. They're going to come snooping and get, you know, like how you see the rat just caught on the trap and can't move. Yeah, it becomes wow. And before you know it, you know, that person is now struggling with themselves and the community because they are in a process of transformation. So, in a real way, you know, if the things we say about Rastafari are really important and serious and truthful to us, then the early expressions of the movement was to tell our King Rastafari doctrine around the whole world. So it means that I have good news for you as well. You're going to be curious. I shouldn't really throw you out of the reasoning. You should throw yourself out, if you understand. But you're going to be given fire, you know, and you might emerge as the diamond that we envisioned that you could be. So the security issues are certain. There's some spaces that are more secure. Bobo, for example, has a very inclusive policy. You know, I've seen Caucasian people playing on the drums at the Bobo Shanty space in Kingston, right? But before you get into the Bobo space, you've gone through immigration. Yeah, because they say it's a different community. You know, you are vetted at the gate. If you're a woman, you're vetted by women. If you're a man, you're vetted by men. And then you're asked to pray before the congregation. So, you know, after the Bible puts you through that, you're in, you walk in. There is very clear codes of conduct in that space that you have to govern. And if you don't, you're thrown out. You know, but the bubble space is a little different in that sense, you know, and it has boundaries that are policed. The Nibingi space, it's your own morals and your own conscience that's going to police those boundaries. But it usually works, you know. Interestingly, I tell you, I took students to a field trip and a couple of them lied about something happening and, you know, they just dropped out of the course. You know, they didn't get to do the exam. Students came to me saying, you know, sir, you know, those girls lied and them cheat and whatever, and, you know, they were dishonest with an assignment. They just never got to the exam. So, you know, we kind of, we allow fate to determine the issues that are to be determined by fate. But it's an important question, and that variously is problematized depending on what is happening and how it's happening. You know, I've been in meetings where the meeting have gone totally awry because someone raises the question that why do we have a white person in this room and this is a Pan-African event? And everything stops. You know, and I've also been in meetings where that kind of thing has happened and another white person just raises their hand and say, you know, well, I've been helping with the elders in Washington for the last 15 years and anyone who has any other contribution to help, my email is so and so. So just subverted by demonstrating that I'm here for the works, I'm not here for all of that. You know, So these are issues that, you know, continue to plague us. My experience though, which is what I'm talking about, is that usually Rastafari spaces, their boundary is the faith, and people who cross that boundary, you know, are allowed to test themselves, you know, and, you know, but thanks for that, yeah. Any more questions? You look like you have a question that you're not sure if you should ask. You know?
Actually, we've officially come to the end of
Okay, I
today's.
talked too much.
No, not at all, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
gained so much from your insights, and I don't know if somebody still has a question. I'm sure we can take it up, but I also don't want to delay people who might have to go to another class or whatever. So probably we officially close the session.
Okay.
And I thank you very, very much for being here, and Dominic also for hosting this and asking the questions, everybody for listening and joining in. Yeah, so if there's still
If anyone needs to go.
interest, and I
Just
hear a
a
question here.
short to confirm where a pupil comes as wise as the teacher. So a reference can be found in Psalms 109.
Okay.
Which can be researched later.
See.
And also the Bob Marley Redemption song. Words were taken from Honorable Marcus Garvey. To contextualize.
None but ourselves can free our mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, the reasoning is self-construction, really, you know, and that is public and private. Yeah, I'm sure Dominic has done a lot of reasoning with himself, you know, and outside of himself. I think that's one of the classic. We're not taught enough to listen to our internal voices and to be able to share those voices in ways that can help us to make sense of what's happening internally. You know, we might feel the same way, but we're afraid to speak because we don't think we are worthy of the thoughts. And reasoning tends to provide that space where people can explore their internal voices, you know.
I had another question, just because Marcus Garvey was mentioned, and I wanted to ask, because if the street preaching and Rastafari reasoning emerged around the 1910s, I was wondering, how did those ideas relate to Marcus Garvey's approach? Because it was, Black nationalism is like more, I think, aggressive and not as yeah, so I think that's my goal.
All right, so just a little clarification. I was trying to, in raising the street preaching, I was trying to introduce the critical religious space that emerges. And, you know, there's a wonderful book, I think his name is Elkin, Street Preaching in Kingston. But I'm sure it's in your library. And it's based on that 1910, 1920. Rastafari emerges 2 or so decades later than that. So I'm saying first there was street preaching, and how it introduces the message at street preaching, but evolves now into his own process that he starts to fashion, which is the barnyard, etc. Then the question you asked me now, I'm trying to remember what was the question that she asked me after.
I don't know if it's still relevant, because now that we cleared up the
I think that
time
was,
frame.
yeah, what was it?
How Marcus Garvey plays into all of that, right?
So Garvey, interestingly, Garvey is an organizer, you know, who they say he used to put his hat on his stick and begin his public conversation with a little sketch, a skit, you know. So the fact is that he used drama and theater to interest people and attract people into what he was doing. And this is something we kind of, we're not enough sensitive to. If you're operating now, you have so many ways of attracting people's attention. In 100 years ago, you only had sound. You know, yeah, you could do a billboard that was a notice, but then in a place like Jamaica, great illiteracy. You know, many people who can't read and write. So I think Garvey has to be recognized, and not just Garvey, there are people like Bedward. Bedward is contemporary of Garvey, but more religious. And so there is an awakening happening. Garvey is the most, he's the most famous of the woke, you know, and I'm not using woke like that. But he's part of a space. And early Rastafari are really awoken by Garvey. You know, he's not that present in the Jamaican space when Haile is doing what he is doing, but Garvey has put a foundation of African pride, the same thing as Bedward. Bedward, in fact, told people in a different way, you know, that it was time for a black wall to rise up against the white wall, and he's talking about structural issues, but he's not talking politics. You know, in what becomes more politicized as the 20th century goes on. So the earliest politicians were religious leaders. And interestingly, what happens in the 1930s is that the political track gains greater respectability than the religious track. So, you know, all of the little African religious things become a kind of overzealous, and the educated Jamaicans who went to Oxford and Cambridge and came back and started political parties kind of gained respectability to lead the nation to independence. But, you know, Garvey did both. He wasn't really a religious leader, but he could have been, you know, but he embraced the political platform in trying to, you know, awaken the society in a specific way. So, yeah, Garvey's foundation is indelible within Rastafari. You know, Rasta have him in a trinity, you know, which elevates him as Black Moses, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, again, good.
And speaking about the proximity also in space, for example, in the context of street preaching, one of the first things usually when I come to Kingston is I go on East Parade to Coke Chapel Steps. That was the place where Marcus Garvey was also preaching, but was the first time where Leonard Howell was preaching. So also they shared also spaces, or Leonard Howell came into spaces where Marcus Garvey was for some years already established. So it was a very close proximity.
And Howell had also worked with Garvey in the States as well, so, you know, yeah. In fact, he kind of, each adds an incremental difference, which is where what we bring to the table becomes so important. You know, that, yeah, you have something to bring to the table. You know, it's really to find that nugget.